Well, welcome everyone. My name is Ryan Williams. I'm president of the Claremont Institute. Thanks for joining us this evening for this book event with Mollie Hemingway and John Eastman. As I often do with these things, just wanted to say a few words. Oh, yeah. I'll get to that. I can't just wear it around, Mark. Be unseemly, you know. I'll get to that. As those of you who've been to these before know, I ask for your indulgence, I just want to say a few words about what we're up to these days. I have a new handy slide. Our Vice President of Education, Matt Peterson, and the executive editor of our newish online publication, The American Mind, were out in the country today talking to some important people about the future of the right and the future of the conservative movement and the institutions they ought to support. They may have mentioned Claremont. But I often like to say we've always been, in a shorthand way of saying what we've been up to at Claremont for these many 40 years, is we educate, we litigate, and we write. But James put it better today on a presentation he gave, and I'm going to get a little Jesse Jackson on you. We educate, we litigate, we communicate, we infiltrate, and we innovate. So our 3 summer fellowships, Publius, Lincoln, and John Marshall, for mid-career folks, early career folks in law, policy, journalism, working in Washington, D.C., and in New York, and basically anyone influencing the national political conversation. That's our target audience for those. And we have a newish speechwriters fellowship as well for working speechwriters in Washington. John Center, the Center for Constitutional Jurisprudence, is where we do all of our litigation. We had kind of a record couple of years here. We've filed 20 briefs in the Supreme Court over the last 2 years, and John's been involved in at least 4 direct representation cases. So we're bringing the principles of the founding of the courts, as we have for many years under John's leadership. And then communication of the Claremont Review books, most of you know it, and our new publication, The American Mind, which is online, and really its centerpiece of it is a weekly feature where we try and engage the ideas that are driving our politics today. And the infiltration operation is we now have 700 alumni from these programs. We have 25 or 30 folks working in this administration and around Capitol Hill, and they're really our mission on the march in national policy. And then the innovate side, this is something new. Our placeholder name for it for now seems to change every week, but we'll firm it up here in the coming weeks, I'm sure, is the Center for the American Way of Life, which will be based in Washington, D.C., and it will have some policy function, but will mainly be a vehicle for speaking frankly about the most pressing issues confronting the conservative movement and really the preservation of America today. We think in certain ways the 40, 50, 60, 70, 80-year-old legacy think tanks in Washington need a little juice. And so we're out there to provide it. Our home has always been here in California and will remain so. Being outside the Beltway has its perks. It keeps you out of that sort of perpetuating loop of groupthink. And so we're going to preserve that part of the core of what we do. But we think time grows short for the Republic, so it's time to get more involved in Washington. It's a target of opportunity, really, not a moving of our core mission or our core location. And with that, I thank you for all that. We at Claremont, we're a C3. We raise all of our money. About 98% of our revenue comes from folks like you and foundations. So I just want to recognize some people here who helped make this possible. A few board members, Keith Carlson, Roy Crummer, and Larry Matson. Thank you all. Keith was also an alumni of one of our programs, and Roy and Larry are on our host committee, which helps support our annual events and programming, and Larry's also in our Legacy Society, so appreciate you all very much. We have some fellowship sponsors here tonight, so our summer fellowships, which I mentioned, you can sponsor a fellow. Julie and Lance Markowitz, Ryan and Jeff Newman, and Gary Lehner. Thanks so much. And then finally, more host committee members who support our events year-round and help us spread the word and meet new folks. Robert DePietro, Jeff Lewis, Michael and Miriam Miller, Catherine and Frank Price, Livia Solti-Bowman, and Yuri Vanatek. So thank you all very much. With that, let me get us to our main event. I don't really have to tell this well-connected audience here that Mollie Hemingway is a national treasure. You all know that. Mollie and her husband Mark did our Lincoln Fellowship a few years back, and at the time we got them cheap, you know. Now Mollie's famous, so, and wouldn't have time for that kind of thing, so we're grateful to her. Her co-author, Carrie Severino, is also a national treasure. Carrie's on the front lines of helping get confirmed administrations and past administrations, judges. And so Carrie and Mollie are some of the busiest people we know. Mollie, of course, is a Fox News contributor, a senior editor at the Federalist, and a newish named senior journalism fellow at the Kirby Center for Hillsdale in Washington, D.C. She's also the proud mother of two, and I don't know how she does it all, but we're happy to have her. I need to write her husband Mark a note saying thank you for letting us borrow her. And then John, most of you know, of course, John Eastman, a Claremont Institute board member, been involved with the organization for many, many years. He's the Henry Salvatori Professor of Law and Community Service at Chapman University's Fowler School of Law, former candidate for Attorney General here in California, all around patriot and public-spirited, and I'm just blessed to have him as a colleague. So with that, I'll turn it over to John. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, President Williams. The last time those words were said together was by President Trump when you received the National Humanities Medal on behalf of the Claremont Institute. That was a great event. And I think a real testament to the work we've been doing over the last 40 years, changing and shaping our politics and reminding our fellow citizens of the importance of the American founding. I do have one other additional introduction I want to make. We're graced tonight by former Ninth Circuit Judge Alice Kaczynski. So this book, Justice on Trial, you know, many of you are younger than me, you may not remember this. Back in 1991, I was driving across the country when the last big controversial set of hearings went on. And at the end of that set of hearings, on billboards across the country, almost everybody was supporting Clarence Thomas. And over the intervening 25 years, that large collective conscience of the rightness of his position and the travesty that went on was deliberately whittled away because our side didn't understand how vicious and how determined the other side was to change the narrative. They played the same set of cards with Brett Kavanaugh, except we now have Mollie Hemingway and Carrie Severino to make sure that that whittling away doesn't go on. And it's so important that this book has come out, and it was the first one out, and I know that was not an easy task. I mean, things were still happening, and they're in the book. I don't know how you were very prescient. So tell us your thinking on getting the book out first, getting it out fast, and the collaboration with Carrie.
You have identified what was our thinking in writing the book. My co-author, Carrie Severino, clerked for Justice Thomas. I was deeply moved by those hearings as well. I happened to be in California at the time. I was a teenager and I was watching those hearings with my mother, and they really shaped my thinking. And it was interesting how many of the people that we interviewed who are now, you know, adults in their 40s or 50s who said that those Thomas hearings really radicalized them in a sense, made them realize the lengths that people will go to in these Supreme Court battles. And we knew when the Kavanaugh confirmation battle was happening, I was covering it as a reporter, Carrie was working on the process. We did, at the time, see a lot of similarities with what had happened with Justice Thomas, including just when the first allegations came out. People who knew their history said, man, is that similar to what happened to Justice Thomas. Wait until the hearings are done, then release this last-minute accusation. You know, doing the hearing, the reopened hearings. It was all basically a movie we had watched before. But the issue that you raised was the thing that people learned from. When Justice Thomas was confirmed, opinion polls showed that by a wide margin, Americans believed him and not Anita Hill, who had accused him of sexual harassment. Or do you remember how people used to say in that time? harassment for some reason. They all just joined. I for some reason remember that. So in the intervening decades, there were books and magazine articles and documentaries and movies to rewrite the history to make her seem like a credible witness. At the time, you remember the FBI agents who interviewed her said her story kept changing. Colleagues of both Anita Hill's and Justice Thomas's said the story was exactly the opposite, that Anita Hill had been pursuing him and he had been politely declining her advances. And yet after decades of rewriting the history, now if you took an opinion poll, you would probably have a lot of Americans saying they believed her, even though very few people did at the time. So knowing that the push to tell a story about Kavanaugh would never end, we just wanted to get the accurate story out. And so we also did know that it had to be the first book out, which we way overshot what that required. We got our book out in July, and the next book didn't come out until September, and then the real, the big effort to frame the narrative came out this week with Ruth Marcus of the Washington Post had a book come out this week where she goes after the entire conservative judicial movement.
Yeah. So I want to ask you what it was like working with Carrie, but I want to set this up by, I suspect there are a couple of things that she snuck into the book that maybe you weren't aware of, or such Clarence Thomasisms. Like there's one, many worried that Brett Kavanaugh was just another Bushy hiding in the tall grass. Now, did you know that's one of Thomas's famous lines, or did she sneak that by you?
So we really did do so much together, so I don't recall that, but we heard from a lot of people that there was concern about Brett Kavanaugh. When he was placed on the short list, everyone kind of knew that meant that he would be the likely next nominee. He's been talked about as the likely next nominee since 2012 when that was written in the New Yorker. He was an extremely persuasive judge on his lower court. He was the guy who would always get the Supreme Court to sort of follow his line of reasoning. He's one of the most persuasive people out there, but definitely not a fire breather like some of the other short list nominees. And some people were hoping for someone more dramatically, maybe rhetorically more conservative or something. Now, we go through the process of how he was picked, and a big reason why he was picked was knowing that he could get through the Senate. One of our sources in the White House said that the people of Alabama made the decision to nominate Brett Kavanaugh when they put a Democrat in the Senate, when they elected Doug Jones. That gave Republicans no margin for error. So they couldn't put in someone who could possibly cause a Republican to peel away. They knew they weren't going to get any Democratic support. They had to get someone who was just beyond reproach, someone who was so well regarded, and that person was Brett Kavanaugh. And you still see the lengths that people went to disparage him.
So that margin of victory, a lot turned on Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski. And one of the things that had social conservatives concerned is promises that Brett would make to Senator Collins and Senator Murkowski to try and hold their vote. Senator Murkowski voted against them anyway. And just to tie it to current events and the FBI and the IG report that's going to come out next week and all that, Lisa Murkowski is in the Senate because of malfeasance by the Department of Justice and the FBI against Ted Stevens. I mean, this is a play that keeps on giving for them, just like the attacks on Bob Bork that gave us Anthony Kennedy. What was that like? Those conversations? You guys really got into the deep weeds on the interactions with Brett Kavanaugh as he was going around to the senators and trying to hold the votes on this extremely narrow thing. What did you learn about that in the process?
It was so interesting. We talked with so many senators who were involved in the process. Susan Collins is someone I have covered for decades, and she's much more liberal than I am. Just she's a moderate Republican.
Attila the Hun is much more liberal than you are. So that's
but I've always found her to be extremely just a solid person. She takes her role very seriously, and I think how she handled this Kavanaugh confirmation is a great example of that. She does not even serve on the Senate Judiciary Committee, but she hired literally a dozen attorneys to help her go through Kavanaugh's rulings, his speeches, his law review articles. She clearly knew more about his record than people who were even on the Judiciary Committee. In some cases, she knew more about his record than people who were like actually working on the confirmation process. At one point, someone was saying that they didn't like something that he had written, and she said, "Oh, but did you notice in footnote 4, he specifically says not to interpret it that way?" And the person's like, "No, I didn't notice footnote 4, of course." She took her job seriously. She didn't think that people should reflexively say they were going to vote for him or against him. And she wanted assurance that he would do his job well. She received that assurance through his record. Also, she had a very lengthy meeting with him. And one thing that we thought was kind of funny about it, when you make it through these Senate meetings with senators, you're meeting with all the key senators when you are nominated for this position. And the White House really felt they had gotten through this meeting very well. And she had to end the meeting so she could go vote. And as she is leaving, she says, "I would love to have another meeting with you." And they're all like, "No, we've done great. Like, we've got to get out of here now." And Justice Kavanaugh says, "Well, that would be wonderful." And they're like, "Oh, we thought we had really done well here." But that was very providential too, because their rescheduled meeting, or their second meeting, was scheduled for a time that happened to be after the allegations came out. So she was able to have a conversation with him and hear from him directly that the allegations were false. And they built up enough rapport that she took that very seriously. Also, he's such a careful person. He is so careful to avoid being caught in any way having perjured himself that it would be very frustrating for his advisors. You know, people would say, "Did you ever meet with so-and-so?" And he'd be like, I can't say for certain unless I have, I need to review my record or whatnot." When these allegations came out, he just said, "Absolutely false. That never happened." And these people who had been so frustrated by his care and precision to never say anything that might later come back as problematic, they knew that they could trust him because he had been so careful about that. And Susan Collins was one of those people who had found him to be a very reliable narrator and very careful with what he had said. When she votes for him, she doesn't just vote for him, she gives a speech on rule of law, standards of evidence, and why we care about certain things like presumption of innocence. So it was much more than just a vote. It was really a service to the whole country. You compare it with Lisa Murkowski, who also gave a speech that I think it is fair to say made no sense at all. She said that she didn't think that he had done what he was accused of, but just like at the moment it wasn't good time to confirm someone like him. It didn't really, there was no clear line of logic in it. And also she really took away the power that she had. Before the Kavanaugh nomination, she was consulted by the White House to find out, what type of justice she was looking for and whatnot. At this point, after all the efforts that they put into getting her to secure her vote, they're not going to waste that time next time, precisely because they don't need to, because there's a bigger majority too, if there is a next time in the near term.
Could I have two more and make John Roberts' vote irrelevant? I want to ask you the bigger question. So this, it was very clear to me that when the list was augmented after Don McGahn got over to the White House and that Brett Kavanaugh was put on, he was not on the original list that the president put out, which I think was a bold strategic move that probably more than anything won him the election. And then they add 4 or 5 people to the list. One of them is Kavanaugh. You could ignore who the other 4 were because it was going to be Kavanaugh. How much of that was Don McGahn? How much of it was President Trump? One of the things that I thought the original list did was not pick anybody from in D.C. because it was part of the, we're going to go to D.C. to drain the swamp, and having people in D.C., particularly with such strong ties to the Bush administration and the Bush family and the Bush aristocracy, or if you want to call it that, that the president had just defeated Jeb Bush pretty soundly in the primaries. Was this a move to make nice with the establishment and Don with the conduit, or what did you learn?
Okay, I thought this stuff was so interesting to learn about the formation of the list. So everything the background is in 2015, Donald Trump starts to do well in Republican circles. And it is deeply alarming to a lot of people who think that he is just a squishy liberal. And in Iowa, where he is campaigning, word gets out that he is going to nominate his sister, who is a liberal federal judge, to the Supreme Court. One of my fun things about researching this was going back to the original interview where this claim was supposedly made, and it wasn't made. It was a good example of how people misinterpret him. He was talking, in fact, about how he didn't like Chief Justice Roberts. He wished he'd been stronger, more courageous. He really likes Thomas and Scalia. Scalia is still alive at this point, how he would nominate judges like them. And then the interviewer is like, but your sister's a federal judge, how about her? And he's like, oh, no, that wouldn't be good. And they're like, you're not gonna support your sister? And he's like, my sister's great, we'll see. Something like that. But he'd clearly not supported his sister, but this somehow became a talking point. So people are really concerned. When Justice Scalia dies, there is a conversation that day between Don McGahn and President Trump talking about how it's going to be an issue because that night there is a debate. So Don McGahn says, I would be unsurprised if that's not the first question you're asked. In fact, the debate that night, first question goes to Donald Trump and it's about justices. And he does something, he breaks from precedent a bit by naming a couple of justices that he would consider. But when they were going through who he might name, there were 3 names that they were rolling about. One of them was, on that day, Kavanaugh. But they decided what you said. It's not good to pick someone who was literally born and raised in Washington, D.C., who is such a creature of the D.C. establishment. Pick other people than him. But he was always under consideration. But when the list comes out, they intentionally do not include some names of people who are inside the Beltway types, because they want to, that is being used as a political thing, and it works. 1 in 4 of Trump's voters said that they voted for him because of the Supreme Court, because that issue was so important. And he put out the list, oddly enough, after he had secured the nomination, essentially, assuming that he made it through the convention, which a lot of people laughed at. Normally you do this to win a primary. You don't come out with this amazingly hardcore list of potential nominees after you have already gotten through the Republican nomination, but he does it late in the process. He updates the list in August or September, I can't remember, and he also responds to a criticism by saying, I will only nominate from this list. And then he does only nominate from that list. Actually, Gorsuch was added at that point. And then they update the list again after Gorsuch is nominated, and that's when Kavanaugh shows up, that's when Amy Coney Barrett shows up on the list. So some names that people were, either because they were eligible because they had been confirmed as federal judges or because it's safer now to mention him. When Kavanaugh shows up on that list, though, everybody knows what it means, that if there's an opening, it's going to be Kavanaugh, almost certainly.
So I want to push on this a little bit more because Justice Kavanaugh, Judge Kavanaugh, I knew him when he was just Brett Kavanaugh, right? He was a colleague of mine at Kirkland and Ellis. He had a reputation on the DC circuit, also in the Bush administration, of avoidance, right? And you actually have a whole discussion of this in the book about his avoidance. And if President Trump's angst with John Roberts is probably because of his avoidance on striking down Obamacare. Brett's decision on the DC circuit on Obamacare laid the path for that. Are we in for more of John Roberts with Brett Kavanaugh, or do you have a different sense of him than that?
So I think he is, I actually remember what someone said after he was confirmed and it was this horrible process. I said, do you think he'll respond to what he went through by being a little more hardcore? And the person said, for better or for worse, he will remain absolutely the same. But in general, that's a pretty good thing. This is a guy who is very persuasive with getting moderates to rule in a more, rule more strictly in adherence to the Constitution. This is an important skill. I think his role when he was on his federal court was getting Anthony Kennedy to join the sort of conservative majority. Similarly, I think he could be seen as someone who might have that same role with the Chief Justice, getting him to be on the right side of things. But he's a fairly moderate person. He was the guy who was in the majority more than any other justice in his first term. He wrote in a way very similar to how he had written during his 12 years on the lower court. He's not a showboater. He's very logical. He's very persuasive. He is who he is, but he also, I would say, the thing that I think people are excited about is that he cares deeply about the administrative state. He and Gorsuch are somewhat unique in this regard on the court. They understand the threat posed by an unaccountable administrative state, and they both have really unique and interesting ways for tackling that. So if you believe, like I do, that that is kind of the current big threat that needs to be tackled, I think there's a lot of reason for hope. He will not be Scalia or Gorsuch-like in other ways, though.
Yeah, that's fair. But it's huge. I mean, the things that he's going to be rock solid on. I mean, look, our litigation center started pushing on these things nearly 20 years ago, on getting rid of these deference doctrines to the administrative state, reviving notions of separation of powers, a thing called the non-delegation doctrine. I always laugh about this one. It's one of those obscure doctrines buried deep in the Constitution. It's Article 1, Section 1, Clause 1. The legislative powers herein granted are vested in Congress, right? Right? Not in the EEOC or the FCE or the, you know, I want to get one of those machines and pull out 3 balls and see how many federal agencies we can make. And he's been rock solid on that stuff, including in his first term on the court. There was a case where he had to recuse himself because it was argued before he got there, a Gundy. It was whether the Attorney General could retroactively apply the sex offender registration statute when Congress hadn't made that determination its own and just kicked it over to the Attorney General to make the law on this. A huge non-delegation problem. And the court split 5-3, Alito joining with the liberals, but it was a most interesting opinion. Alito said, I've already expressed my view that we need to revive the non-delegation doctrine, but we don't have a majority of the court now, so until we have a majority, I'm going to stick with this. Now, that strategic vote allowed Neil Gorsuch's dissenting opinion to see the light of day, and it was a scathing attack on the violation of separation of powers that they've been doing for 70 years. If Alito doesn't cast his vote that way, it's a 4-4 split, and you get one line out of the Supreme Court. It just says the lower court decision is affirmed by an equally divided court. Now, last week, Brett Kavanaugh, that case is up on a petition for rehearing, which is extremely rare, and he writes an opinion concurring in the denial of rehearing, said we already settled it on this particular case, but I'm with Alito and with the Gorsuch dissent. I think we need to revive the non-delegation doctrine. We have won this fight, and it's because Brett's our 5th vote on there, or Justice Kavanaugh's our 5th vote. More? Yeah, go ahead.
I just want to say one more thing on that too, which is I think he does, based on what I've heard from his conversations with other people, find it a bit frustrating that he has this reputation for not being as strong. I think from his perspective, particularly given his background, he was doing politically risky things, such as working on the Whitewater investigation, working in the Bush administration. He didn't always play it safe, and he feels like he doesn't get enough credit for how much he was willing to step out a little bit. And the Trump administration, say what you want about whatever they're doing, they really screened for courage. One of the things that they'd done was kind of learned from previous Republican administration mistakes. Almost every Republican has squandered what they've been given in terms of Supreme Court nominations. Going back to Eisenhower, it is extremely frustrating how serious some of those mistakes were and how much bad came out of those mistakes, whether it was picking people for just political reasons or thinking that the way to get a nomination through was to pick someone with no record, not screening for courage. There is this pattern of people going onto the court and then drifting. And so they kind of learned from all of these previous mistakes, and they really did screen for it, not just through rulings, but also through looking for evidence that people had taken difficult positions when it might cost them career and otherwise. So I think they did screen for this.
They also did it with a sense of humor. There's one story you all recount in the book when Jonathan Bunch at the Federalist Society, right before the Iowa caucuses, meets with Don McGahn and presses him hard about judges. And McGahn says, "Don't worry, we got it covered. We've hired John Sununu to pick our judges." And he's got 2 lists. He's got one of pragmatic people with no paper trail, and he's got another with conservatives that can't possibly get through, and we're going to throw that out. And Bunch is just beside himself. And he said it took him about 10 minutes before he figured out that McGahn was joking with him.
The Federalist Society had been trying to reach out to every campaign to just get contact with them, but they hadn't had any contact with the Trump campaign. This was like their first conversation with them, and they were like, "Oh, this is our worst like scenario coming to light." And of course, you could not have probably had a more thorough working through of this issue with Don McGann and other people. And we will say we talked with other campaigns, and they felt like there was no room for criticism on how they handled judges, that their list was brilliant, that it just changed the shape of politics, that they think that people will have to be more transparent about what they're going to do, because Republican voters are sick and tired of electing people who claim they're going to do a good job and then they squander it. So it's just kind of changed the dynamic.
I heard Kamala Harris was going to announce that she was going to put Pam Carlin on her list.
Well, you know, what's interesting, Pam Carlin was a shortlister under the Obama administration, and just imagine if she were
I said this on Laura Ingram's show last night, because it was, if you saw any of the hearings, and I don't recommend it if you didn't see it yesterday, she's just vitriolic and angry, and I actually said on Laura's, well, you know, she thought she was going to get a Supreme Court nod from Hillary Clinton if president, and that didn't work out so well, so she's got reason to be angry, I suppose. But I want to ask you how much access you had, if any, to Brett Kavanaugh and his wife and family. Was that part of your investigative reporting for this book?
We interviewed more than 100 people, key people at the White House, senators, many Supreme Court justices, other federal judges, and we in general don't say who we talk to. So the access was amazing, and I do think we have to thank Ruth Marcus for that. She is the Washington Post editorial page person who had a book out this week. And she, when it was announced that she was going to write a book on the Kavanaugh confirmation, so many people who were involved with it said they would refuse to talk to her because she was so liberal and she had done so much to run the anti-Kavanaugh effort that nobody really wanted to talk to her. But they did want to tell a story. They thought that they had done good work. They thought that this was a really interesting story of how to overcome various obstacles. And so because of her writing the book, we got really great access to so many people, and I think it shows in the book. And we did, I do want to say, I'm glad that we were able to tell the story about the Kavanaugh family. I think that was one of the things that was so grueling about watching it last year, was seeing that this was a person with a wife and daughters and mother and father and what they were going through. And we also, you know, this was kind of a local story in Washington, D.C. Brett Kavanaugh grew up there. Also, his first accuser, Christine Blasey Ford, grew up there. So we talked to a ton of people who knew both of them. Interestingly enough, there's no evidence that either of them have ever met, apart from her claim. But there were people who went to school with her and knew Justice Kavanaugh, and we got some really interesting stories from them. And we also heard a lot about what her family thought, which I think is probably apparent to a lot of people, that the family didn't seem to believe her about this claim. And we were able to report after the book came out, we were working to get it in there, but that her father had told Justice Kavanaugh's father that he was glad that Brett was confirmed. So, and he also wrote him a note saying that as well. So.
Very good, very good. Tell me more about the working relationship between the two of you. 6 kids running around working on this book.
It's a total of 8 kids between the two.
Oh, that's
of us.
right.
So,
that's what I meant. 8. Yeah, 8.
But yeah, Carrie is someone that I had talked to for my reporting for many years. She was just very informed. She knew a lot about different judges. She's just a very well-connected person. But I don't exactly know why I thought it would be a good idea to write with her, except it was perfect. I mean, it was just wonderful. I wouldn't normally recommend, like, agreeing to write a book with someone that you'd never worked with before.
Who's a lawyer? Yeah, who's a lawyer?
But it was, well, that was even that was great. She's a former Supreme Court clerk, went to Harvard Law School, is extremely knowledgeable on the Supreme Court and the conservative judicial movement. And then with my journalism background, you know, my husband in my ear constantly saying, remember to make this a readable book, like make it a story, don't just, you know, lecture to people. It was just a great combination. But we owe a debt of gratitude to our husbands, who did so much work while we were, this was a really intensive and detailed book, and it took us working around the clock for several months, and our families probably suffered a little bit from that, but it's over now, so so hopefully they'll appreciate it someday.
Well,
my children were sleeping on the floor of my office just so they could get time with me, and it made me feel so sad. But
well, she had 6, but the older ones were old enough to actually take care of getting dinner for the younger ones. So that, read the acknowledgments that both of them do at the end of the book. It's priceless. Anything else you want to say before we open it up for questions? No? All right. Let's open it up for questions.
You have up there future of the Supreme Court. I didn't hear anything on that.
Okay, good.
Yeah, the question is on the future of the Supreme Court. And that was one of the things we wanted to do. We knew it was an amazing story of the Kavanaugh confirmation, but we wanted to look at the history of Supreme Court confirmation battles, putting it in context. And it's not just Thomas, it's so many. There has been a real ramping up of tension in recent decades on the entire judicial confirmation process. We wanted to get that in there, and it was just a perfect story because there were so many flashbacks where you could look at previous confirmation battles and what you could learn from them, but also looking forward to the future and looking at some of the implications of what happened. You know, people think, well, Brett Kavanaugh was confirmed, conservatives won this battle, so let's all move on. But I thought it was interesting that Deborah Katz, Christine Blasey Ford's attorney, said that one of her motivations was to place, one of her motivations, and a motivation shared by her client, she claimed, was to put an asterisk next to the name of Brett Kavanaugh so that any ruling he had would be tarnished somehow. And I think that was something that they have had some success with. They want to make it so that people who are conservative won't even be willing to be named as a nominee for the Supreme Court or for other high-profile positions. And that is a concern that some people have. They might be willing to go through a nasty confirmation battle, but they might not be willing to put their family through such a thing. And if you can scare good people away from doing that service, that's a win for the left. And we look at how nobody who made false allegations was held accountable. I mean, you had a lot of room to hold people accountable in this. You had people who were referred for criminal prosecution for making false allegations against Brett Kavanaugh. You had witness tampering claims made to the FBI. I mean, one of the things that we talk about in the book is about how Leland Kaiser, who was Christine Blasey Ford's friend, was named as a witness to the party where this alleged assault took place. And not only does she say she has no memory of it, she actually remembers that summer quite well and comes to lose confidence in her friend's story. And when she says these things, she's targeted by mutual friends to change her story. They discuss whether to reveal embarrassing information about Leland as a pressure or to delegitimize her. And they tell her that that they really want her to change her story. And she ends up telling the FBI about that. And this is a woman who's liberal, formerly married to Bob Beckel. Lifelong liberal, doesn't want Brett Kavanaugh on the court.
That doesn't drive you away from being liberal. I don't know what would.
But she doesn't even want him on the court, but she doesn't want to lie. And she's something of a heroine in this, I think, in that unlike so many people in this story, she was doing this against her political interests. But nothing has been done on any of these matters. You had senators violating committee rules, and nothing happening to them. Corey Spartacus Booker violating committee confidential issues. Dianne Feinstein going out of her way to violate the processes that were in place. Kamala Harris doing that nasty perjury trap. And there was no censorship of these people. There was no investigation into how they ran their operation. The lawyers clearly mishandled their client. Christine Blasey Ford claimed that she was never told by her lawyers that Senate staff were willing to come out to California to interview her, which was what her wish was. Just in general, some mishandling of her by the attorneys, and nothing's been done. I mean, nothing's been done. So if there are no repercussions for making false claims or for engaging in this kind of behavior, it's also more likely that it'll happen in the future, and that is a concern. But ultimately, we talk about how the court itself has some responsibility for this. The more political the court is, the more it's reasonable for people to treat it like a political process. And so by having a more proper understanding of what their role is, they can help take away some of this politicized campaigning that goes on.
The one part of that story that you left out, I think, was the vicious attacks on Susan Collins to try and get her to change her vote.
I mean, she suffered her husband was home when a biological terror attack, or like when something was sent in the mail that was threatened or claimed to be ricin, and they put their whole house in quarantine. Their dog had to go in quarantine. They couldn't go home. She also had, I thought this was just so interesting, she has a place on Capitol Hill, and as she was preparing to go vote, there was a drum circle outside her house that was waking everybody up very early in the day. And as she was leaving her house, her next door neighbor is also outside, and she apologizes to him that the commotion must have woken him up. And he said, "Oh, I think their music is beautiful. It's living next to a rape apologist that I find loathsome." I mean, just, oh, and she had her, so they actually started threatening her in June, so before Kavanaugh is even nominated. They're sending threatening packages to her offices in Maine. Her staff are receiving threatening phone calls. One of her employees was forced to quit because someone called and threatened rape. And she thought it was interesting that these people, in the name of women's rights, were driving young women out of public service. And yeah, she endured so much more than most people, and that she ended up that process with this strong defense of rule of law is very admirable.
So long-term, Supreme Court, I mean, I think it's, I think President Trump's concerns about John Roberts are valid on the big issues. We've seen that play out a couple of times. We didn't learn much about how Brett Kavanaugh is going to come down on those big issues last year. The one case that kind of presented itself as a really important opportunity they punted on, that was the Indiana abortion case. And even the Sex Offender Registration Act, which dealt with non-delegation issues, administrative state stuff, not really Sex Offender Registration Act, but that was the vehicle for that coming up. They could have scheduled it for re-argument, and they didn't, because given what went on in the confirmation hearings, they didn't want to force him to be the deciding vote on reviving a non-delegation doctrine, on striking down a retroactive application of the Sex Offender Registration Act, right? So they punted on that. But we've got those cases this term. We've got 3 cases involving Title VII and Title IX, definition of sex discrimination from the 1964 Civil Rights Act, whether it applies to transgender, gender identity, and sexual orientation. Brett Kavanaugh is going to be the swing vote on those cases. We've got the Louisiana abortion case coming up, where he's now the key vote, having replaced Anthony Kennedy. Kennedy was the key vote that struck down Texas's restriction, saying abortion providers have to have admitting privileges at a local hospital. Louisiana has a nearly identical statute, but it's not as spread out as Texas was, so there's some factual distinctions. But that case is up there. We've got a Second Amendment case that's up there. So these are high-profile cases, and I think it's going to tell us a lot about where Brett Kavanaugh comes down for the long haul. And the other thing that's happening is Ruth Ginsburg has been in for the 3rd pancreatic surgery or something. It's conceivable that we have another vacancy in the middle of a presidential election year, and I'm fairly certain that Mitch McConnell won't be as keen on holding up the vote on that one as he was on the last one. So there's lots to still be decided, but also a lot riding on the next election, which is why I think the impeachment hearings have gotten so vicious and so out of control. They're trying to block this president from having the replacement for both Ruth Ginsburg and Steve Breyer, whether it happens in the next few months or whether it happens in the next 2 or 3 years. Those two would, if you put Bill Pryor and Amy Coney Barrett or Joan Larson or several of the people we've been given our Reagan Jurisprudence Award to over the years, not an accident, I'm going to tell you. You put those on in place of Breyer and Ginsburg, then you've got Thomas and Alito and Gorsuch and Kavanaugh and Roberts, but you kind of stick in there either before or after Kavanaugh, Amy Coney Barrett and Bill Pryor. That's a pretty impressive set of judges up there. And having a whole slew of things that make Kagan and Sotomayor 7-2 votes would be pretty nice for the future of the Supreme Court. Kind of like if John Sununu hadn't picked David Souter over Edith Jones. Right?
That's what I kept thinking as you were saying this. Like, there were so many missed opportunities in the past, again, that had very serious ramifications. But yeah, this issue will continue to be pressing, and it does seem that Republican voters have been a little smarter about this than voters on the left. partly because they had to be. They recognized what was happening at the court, and they were seeing these threats, and they started caring more about Senate races. One of the things we get into in the book is how the conservative groups start just devoting much more to getting a Republican Senate, knowing that that is key, no matter who is the president. And I do think it's just important to clarify, the Garland rule, as it's talked about, there really was historical precedent for Mitch McConnell's look at this. It is extremely rare, you have to go back like 140 or 50 years to find a Senate confirming a nominee of an opposite party president in the final year of his presidency. And so there are multiple things here that don't apply. The Senate is Republican and President Trump is Republican, and while it could be the final year of his presidency, they don't mean the terminal year. You know, the terminal year would be 4 years from now, not now. And so
And it was the Biden rule anyway, wasn't it?
yeah, yeah. It was fun actually looking at all the ways that Biden was helpful. I think we had like 3 examples of Biden saying things that came back. Tell on Tim later, but
Back, Keith.
So a little bit from an institute standpoint, to the degree you can see any daylight between a Scalia jurisprudence and a Thomas jurisprudence, I'm thinking of the idea of the future of the Supreme Court. Can you look forward to see if Kavanaugh, you would anticipate being someone that goes from a philosophical standpoint or an approach standpoint to a natural law analysis on things, or where do you see his normal prism directing him on some of the fundamental questions of interpretation with respect to the Constitution?
yeah, I'm not sure if I'm the right person to answer it, but I do want to say, I think the thing to look at, I think he's just going to be very consistent with where he has been. I don't think you will see much of a transition from his previous way of looking at it. When you were talking about some of the cases, by the way, there's reason to be concerned, I would say, on some of those cases. His abortion jurisprudence, if you are concerned about the way that the court has ruled on abortion in recent years since 1973, there's room for concern there. He hasn't been aggressive or particularly. He's a very smart man, and he figures out really good ways to do things with different rulings. I think he's political. I think he's cautious. He's sober. He's kind of conservative by nature. One of the things that we looked at in the book was how he's very much like a George Bush conservative, and then the irony of him having to fight like a Trump person in order to get on the court. But it was actually kind of a moment for the entire movement to blend those things too. I think a lot of conservatives do find themselves more keen on George Bush style of being, but recognizing the limits of that when you're dealing with a particularly aggressive left. As far as his jurisprudence, I mean, one of the things I think is like, I like reading Scalia opinions. I like reading Gorsuch opinions. They're fun. They are really, I mean, they're just so well written, and they're fun to look through. And I'm not even saying that I don't think Gorsuch and Scalia are particularly similar despite their affinity for each other or whatnot. Kavanaugh is not so fun, but he's really doing a good job of making a persuasive case for other judges. And but I think he'll just be consistent in his philosophy, which is he has I forget exactly how he refers to it. Oh darn! Even his own interpretation of his originalist understanding is a little bit different than some other originalists, but within the wider scope.
Yeah, and I think you're right to point out some concern. I mean, after his meeting with Senator Collins, she comes out and announces that he has stated to her that he agreed with Roberts that Roe is settled law, that Obergefell, which is a same-sex marriage case, was a fundamental, doctrinal, important decision of his former boss. So I think the social conservatives have right to be concerned about that. I think
I will say that we did talk to people who were in that meeting who said that her statement after the meeting did not match their understanding of what he was saying. This is a perfect Kavanaugh example, though. He's saying something extremely precise about how Chief Justice Roberts answered something in a hearing about precedent and having respect for precedent without being completely bound to it. It was actually, I mean, what Chief Justice Roberts said was in fact completely defensible. She interpreted it as assurance that he would not do anything to disturb abortion jurisprudence, and people within the meeting did not think that it was bad. But yes,
Yeah.
anyway.
Yeah, no, that's a very good insight, because, you know, the coverage that came out of that, you never, see, one of the things you never know here, the coverage that's coming out is trying to drive the agenda rather than accurately reporting it.
I just have to say another quick story about a Senate meeting. He meets with Jeff Flake, who ends up becoming a big figure
By the way,
in our
what a
book,
perfect
too.
name for a senator, I'm sorry.
The Dickensian name. So after each meeting with a Republican, the White House wanted the senators to come out and say nice things to the press that were gathered. But Jeff Flake, they had a perfectly lovely meeting with Jeff Flake. He didn't want to meet with the press. At that time, the Kavanaugh Sherpa, the person who guides you through your Senate meetings, was John Kyle, who was a former senator from Arizona. He then becomes, after McCain dies, he becomes a voting senator on the Kavanaugh thing, so he can no longer be the Sherpa. But because he had been a former senator, he walks out of the meeting with Kyle, and he just marches right up to the press that are gathered, and he's like, well, I can tell you about our meeting with the senator, and who comes out of his office sheepishly but Jeff Flake to join so that he can also perform in front of the cameras. But Jeff Flake becomes a really integral part of the process. One of the most fun things that we wrote about that we had no idea at the time was after the reopened hearings, the Judiciary Committee meets to vote to get Kavanaugh onto the Senate as a whole. And it's expected to go through, particularly since Jeff Flake gives an announcement that he's going to vote for to move Kavanaugh onto the entire Senate. And everything breaks down as Jeff Flake and Chris Coons go into the anteroom off of the hearing room and discuss a plan to extend the FBI investigation for an additional week. People are freaking out. The entire Senate Judiciary Committee leaves the hearing room to go fight in this very tiny anteroom, like basically the size of this stage. It's got like a hallway and a table in there and a bathroom and a little phone booth, and you've got all these senators and their staff. People are stepping on each other's feet. Two senators literally almost come to blows because they're so upset with each other. A Republican senator was so upset at sort of Democratic game playing that he literally almost punches a Democrat. And everyone we talked to who was there said it was the craziest thing they'd ever seen in their entire time in the Senate. And Jeff Flake and Chris Coons are tangled up, their bodies are tangled up in this tiny phone booth where they're on the phone with Rod Rosenstein trying to negotiate an additional FBI investigation. And it's extremely frustrating to everybody involved in the process because they just know that any delay is bad. Except it turned out that this was a delay that was good. The FBI reopens the investigation, they talk to people. Not only do they not find anything, they get some evidence that there was witness tampering and other issues. So the senators feel very, very comfortable voting for Kavanaugh, and it all turned out for good.
Yeah.
Do you know if Ford's still standing by all her claims, and has her life changed at all since the hearings?
The question is about whether Christine Blasey Ford stands by her claims and whether her life has changed at all since the hearing. She has received several awards. She just recently won an award from the ACLU, ironically enough, of Southern California, a Courage Award.
I heard she got an acting award too. Is that?
You know, it was really, so she had there were GoFundMes that raised close to $1 million for her. There have been multiple awards. I would say she definitely stands by her story, such as it is. It was one of these things that we spent a lot of time looking at, and we didn't, you know, we were looking for any evidence to support or not support it. And there was never any evidence. I mean, we all know that because we all watched the hearings. There was never any evidence in support of her claim. None. I actually just wrote a piece this last week with Carrie on 21 reasons not to believe her claims. There's no evidence that they met. None of the alleged witnesses backed up her claim. You know, like I mentioned, her family didn't believe her. Doesn't match anything that anyone knows about Brett Kavanaugh's life. in the last 40 years. So, we also look a little into memory issues, because I think, people were frustrated by the fact that she came forward with an allegation that she had no evidence to support. But it's also true that, I think it's safe to say she's a somewhat troubled person. There's some issues there maybe with memory. She's had some experience with memory therapies that might have affected her telling of her story. But from our perspective, it was simply, is there evidence? And there was no evidence.
Truth and facts don't matter to the left, but why did Kavanaugh cry?
The question is, why did Kavanaugh cry? Sorry, from my perspective, like...
If a man is falsely accused, he's not going to cry. He's going to get angry.
He got angry. I mean, I think that's what you would say. So one of the things that we looked at was what happens when the allegations come out. And one of the things that was interesting is the White House was actually prepared for something. They knew their Supreme Court confirmation history. They knew that someone would say something. They, in fact, actually had a source who was sort of on the left, but friendly with White House people, who laid out like a three-pronged plan that he'd heard that they were going to do. And it did involve something about, Me Too issues. One of the downsides of having the list out is that it gave opponents a plan of attack for literally everybody on the list. And it was not an unwise theory to try a Me Too thing on Brett Kavanaugh, except for the fact that he turned out to be like a guy who was just thoroughly decent. All of his ex-girlfriends vouched for him. There was, I have this memory of, or I have this like imagination about the moment when he brings forth his calendars to show like what he was doing, and the opposition just going, oh, how did we do that? Like, how did we pick this guy as the one we were going to do? But he was in a crazy frat at Yale. He liked beer, as we all now know in great detail. But it's funny that you said that, though, because so many people we talked to who had experience with false accusations or whatever said that they really identified with his response. And we look throughout the book about this tension that I previously mentioned between the Bush team and the Trump team. And by that I don't mean that they were working for Bush versus Trump, but this was something that people who were working on the confirmation battle identified as like a different disposition. And the Bushies, as they would say, wanted Kavanaugh to come out and just talk about how great women are and how awful sexual assault is, and just almost be like a supplicant and defensive and whatnot. And the Trump team was like, you've been falsely accused, you should just fight it. And the moment the accusation came out, according to our sources in the White House, he was exactly like he was on the day of the hearing. So it was just about whether he needed to tamp that down like he did in the Martha McCallum interview, where he took the Bushy advice, and everybody saw that that was not particularly persuasive, so it liberated him and the team to be more natural in their response to it.
Yes.
What will happen for the next nominee? This only happens when it's the Republicans putting up someone.
Yeah.
But the left, their people go straight through. What can we do to prevent that zoo that we saw the first day when people were yelling? Right.
Well, I mean, so the question is, what happens in the next one? And also a little bit, why don't the Republicans act like this? And I'm going to pick on one of Judge Kaczynski's former colleagues. When Harry Pragerson was nominated by Jimmy Carter, he was asked point blank at his confirmation hearing if the case required him to decide between the clear law of the Constitution or his personal views, which way would he rule? And he said he would advance his personal views. And the senator asked him, maybe I wasn't clear on my question. And he said, no, I heard you, and he repeated the answer. And this is in the transcript of the confirmation hearing. You can go look it up. The problem with that was that he was nearly unanimously confirmed. And if you've got somebody that on the front end is already saying that they're going to violate the oath of office and that our guys vote for them anyway, that's a problem. Our senators need to learn how to hold people to account, that they are not choosing the next politician to be, you know, the kind of governing masters of us if we can get to 5 votes on the Supreme Court. They're supposed to be picking people that are going to faithfully apply the law wherever it goes. And until our senators start using that as a filter for casting a vote, then we're going to continue to lose this battle, because the left has no compunctions about blocking people who will faithfully apply the law if they're not going to push their agenda. We're not asking for people who will push our agenda. We're asking just for people who will faithfully apply the law. But it's going to be, you take the Thomas hearing, the Bob Bork hearing, and the Brett Kavanaugh hearing, multiply that by 100 for the Ruth Bader Ginsburg replacement if it happens on Trump's watch.
I'm actually worried, when I think about how it's gotten progressively worse, where do you take it from here? And it could be very, I don't know, it just seems like there's been no ratcheting down. I also think, by the way, I had someone say this to me, I thought this was sort of compelling. I'm thinking it through. But the question was about if there is an opening in the coming year. The person said that they should definitely confirm a nominee precisely as a response to what they did with Kavanaugh. In other words, the more you act this way, the more we have no choice but to not tolerate your antics. Like, you're not arguing in good faith, you're not doing these confirmation battles in good faith, so we're not even going to worry about responding to your issues.
In fact, Brett was about as moderate a guy that they were going to get out of this administration. I mean, what did they expect? I mean, if they block him, we put up Bill Pryor or Amy Coney Barrett or whatever. I mean, it could not get any better from their perspective. I mean, they're not going to pick Pam Karlan out of the Trump White House.
In fact, there was some discussion if the Kavanaugh confirmation failed because of what happened, they started talking to some other people about whether they would be ready to step up, and these other judges were saying, well, it can't fail. Like, you have to get this person through because they're just going to be worse to us this time around. Like, don't expect that it would be better or that you would get me through after you defeated, after they defeated Kavanaugh. But
Yeah.
Mollie, I have a question. If it would have been done in the reverse and Gorsuch would have come after Kavanaugh, would Kavanaugh have been torched the way he was if he would have been the first guy up? And what would they have done to Gorsuch? You told us the last time you came to speak to the group that there was a game plan. You alluded to it just now that they were gonna, if it was the right Christian male, they were gonna do a Me Too back in high school. Like they already had the game plan. So do they have a game plan? Did they have one for Gorsuch if the flip had been reversed?
so I think, interestingly enough, the left really was not prepared. I guess this is obvious. The left was not prepared for Donald Trump to win the presidency. Whereas people on the right had to come to terms with it over the course of a year. They might not have been on board initially, but then as he started to work his way through the primaries, they sort of slowly came to terms with it. For a lot of people on the left, it was truly shocking and traumatically so when Trump won the nomination, which meant that they weren't really prepared to fight. And also when he won the election, and that the Senate stayed Republican. So their efforts against Gorsuch could not have been worse. They didn't really run, they were unfair to him. I don't know if you remember the icy trucker scandal that he was supposedly involved in from one of his rulings, but it was nothing like what they did against Kavanaugh. Plus, they blew up the filibuster, which was so unwise. This was sort of similar to how impeachment is an effort to placate the base by doing something. And so they got rid of the filibuster. Well, I should say Mitch McConnell got rid of the filibuster because they tried to filibuster Gorsuch, which was so stupid. They squandered that. That's one of the few things that the minority had to have a role in Supreme Court nomination issues, and because they used it against Gorsuch, someone that everybody found so reasonable and qualified, that those Republican senators who would vote with Democrats to keep the filibuster were said, well, we We can't be held hostage here. So I do think that if Kavanaugh had been first and Gorsuch had been second, well, they probably would have still just gotten rid of the filibuster, and then they would have done something probably similar with Gorsuch. But had they not gotten rid of the filibuster, Kavanaugh would not have been confirmed. So it was just a huge strategic error on the part of Chuck Schumer.
And that started with getting rid of the filibuster for the Court of Appeals so that they could pack the DC circuit. Yeah. Question here and then over here.
With this mania on impeachment, how does that bode for the Supreme Court?
Well, I do think it's interesting that it was in September that there was mania for impeachment for Kavanaugh. You had every single Democratic nominee or candidate person going for the nomination for the Democratic Party saying that they thought he should be impeached. And it turned out that their basis for saying he should be impeached was because of false information that was put out in the New York Times about supposedly another incident that turned out not to be true. Carrie and I actually broke the news about that not being true. So I'm sure those authors love us for stepping on that. But I think if impeachment is successful, by which I mean when and if the impeachment happens, I do wonder if it'll give people a taste for trying out impeachments for other people, whether they will try a Kavanaugh impeachment after that. There are a lot of reasons why that would be a bad idea, completely apart from politics, including that you can't really be impeached for anything you did prior to serving on the court, so it's unclear what the impeachment argument would be. But if they do have success with this, I think that maybe you will see more of a reaction. I don't know. I'm sorry, I'm still thinking through these issues.
I think the adults in the room, which is the Supreme Court, one of the things that I think Carrie brought to the book in particular was the kind of level of collegiality at the court and the welcoming arms that all eight members of the court gave to Brett when he showed up there. And what they see going on with the impeachment and the tax records and the private records and all of that. I mean, we see the headlines every time an Obama district judge rules against Trump. You hardly ever see the fact that almost immediately those court decisions are stayed and the Supreme Court is gradually reversing them. And I think it will be here as well. And I think a linchpin on this, whether we're going to get back into regular order of some sort, is probably going to turn on Elena Kagan. And I don't know how that's going to play out, but it's going to be a very, I think, significant development.
I just want to say I'm glad you did bring up this issue of collegiality on the court. That was one of the most interesting things for me, at least, for interviewing Supreme Court justices, was seeing how much they went out of their way to make sure that, at least from their perspective, that everything could be as normal as possible following the confirmation. The protests that you saw in DC during the Kavanaugh confirmation, I mean, they were happening at the court. People were scaling the walls, pounding on the doors, climbing up on the statues. And it was something that affected the other justices. And when someone is confirmed, you have like a real quick, immediate swearing in by the Chief Justice. That usually is just literally the guy walks across and gets sworn in. In the case of Kavanaugh, the Chief Justice made it known that everybody would be particularly welcome to show up for that. So you had quite a few justices show up on very short notice for that swearing in. They all went over to the White House for the formal swearing in. They all went out of their way to publicly speak well of him. You know, Ruth Bader Ginsburg can't stop talking about how much she respects, how he cares about various issues, or like has so many female clerks and whatnot. Elena Kagan has been that way too. You know, I can't remember which one of them like very publicly shook his hand at the end of the very first day of oral arguments. And they, even if they didn't go through something like Thomas or Kavanaugh did, they all felt that the confirmation process had been kind of ridiculous, and they cared deeply about the court being taken seriously and not being tarnished by some of the sillier stuff that's happening in the Senate. That is a political concern about politics, but it's interesting.
Yeah. Let me see, there was one here.
You had answered the question already, because it was Harry Reid who ended the filibuster for federal courts and district courts.
Yep.
And Mitch McConnell,
Just extended it to one more level.
What goes around comes
That's
around.
right, exactly.
And that's the fear I have about this whole charade that's going on. What goes around comes around. I hope it doesn't. But the other thing in mentioning the viciousness of the attacks on Brett Kavanaugh, I don't know if any of you read, but Turley had an article saying that by the time he got home, he was threatened with death, his wife was threatened with death, his children were threatened with death, because he gave the most rational explanation.
No, and look, I mean, you know, I've debated Jonathan Turley. He and I went back and looked through my notes. He was on the opposite side of me. He was a Democrat witness back in 2006 at a hearing before the House Select Intelligence Committee on, remember when the New York Times published our espionage capabilities? And there was a big hearing about this. I mean, it violated the Espionage Act. I actually testified that, what was the New York Times reporter, ought to have been prosecuted for that. And Turley was defending him on the First Amendment. So we were opposite on this. He was always the go-to Democrat guy. And I think it's going to take people like him stepping up to put a stop to this stuff.
I've noticed throughout his appearances that he has moved to what I call fairness.
Yeah. No, he was always, I mean, he was dead wrong on some things, but honestly wrong. You know, I mean, you know, just reading things differently than I did. You know, a legitimate disagreement on where the law took, not this kind of vicious advocacy. But it's going to take people like him on that side. 'Cause, you know, we don't have people like that on our side, that get this kind of vicious thing. One of the things that I've been, you're kind of deviating a little bit from the book, but I think given everything that's going on, and this was the latest trigger event. One of the things that I've been most impressed about the Trump administration is how they have not taken the precedents set by Obama, drawing outside the lines that they could have run with, and have instead largely, you know, almost entirely stayed within the lines. Part of it's because of the White House counsel's office that Don McGahn put together, including a lot of our former fellows that were in that shop. And they went in with a real sense of legal obligation and constitutional duty. When the temptation had to be, you know, this guy just did it, why don't we do it? You know, right? So maybe there is some hope that we can, instead of swinging the pendulum back, we can, you know, stop it dead. But
actually, I mean, you mentioned the stays, these nationwide injunctions and whatnot, and how infuriating it is that in some cases these are injunctions against simply stopping illicit expansions of authority.
Yeah.
So Obama can just by fiat say that something is this way, and when the Trump administration tries to pull it back, then they get stopped, and it's just very frustrating. I am hopeful that the court might take up these issues. You've had some rumblings about it,
Yeah.
so hopefully we'll.
Oh, another thing you mentioned in the book, I hadn't, I mean, I suspected this, but I hadn't actually put the numbers to it. Over the last 6 administrations combined, going back to Jimmy Carter, so Carter, Reagan, Bush, Clinton, Bush 2, and Obama. In the first 2 years of those presidential administrations, there were only 24 cloture votes total, cumulative, all 6 of them combined. In Trump's first 2 years, there were 128 cloture votes that were necessary. I mean, this is, now, it's partly, they still can't believe that Trump won the election. But I also think it's to try and stop the administration from actually doing the job, because what we're learning, and we're going to learn a lot more on Monday when the IG report comes out, the level of corruption at the highest levels of our government that they never thought would see the light of day because they were so certain that Hillary would get elected. I think a lot of this is charade to try and hide, or to try and prevent them from actually focusing on those things. And so maybe that I was like, I'm such an optimist. Maybe when that stuff all comes out, they all go to jail, it'll settle down.
Okay, well,
I know.
I hate to be the person to micturate in the punch bowl here, but I do think you should not be so optimistic. First off, I just want to say something very quickly, that the Attorney General's speech to the Federalist Society, the Barbara Olson lecture, was excellent, and it was on this point and about how the resistance...
Because Claremont people helped him write it, right?
The resistance has engaged in so many breaking of norms, constitutional norms and otherwise, and how this is really how this is a threat and needs to be taken seriously. And it's not just these cloture votes, but all sorts of other efforts. If I might, really quickly on the IG report, I am a little worried that people are optimistic about this. I'm writing a piece right now, but I'll just kind of go through it. Inspector generals are not good means to achieve justice at all. Inspector generals should be viewed as almost like a corporate HR department. You know, you're very naive if you think that corporate HR department is there for the employee. It's for the corporation. It's there to clean up messes and deal with them in as good of a way as possible. The IG serves the agency and will always make the agency be able to survive any mess that it creates. We already know so much that was wrong about how the Department of Justice surveilled the Trump campaign, wiretaps, human informants, overseas intelligence assets, national security letters. We already know about these things. If the reporting is accurate, I think at best there are 2 criminal referrals out of this. 2 is nothing. You could have gotten 2 within the first 2 weeks of this investigation, which started in March of 2018, if you were being serious, if you actually wanted to investigate this. I actually like Horowitz as far as inspector generals go. His previous reports have been pretty scathing on the one hand, like they do show, and he has he criminally referred Comey, he criminally referred McCabe. But at the end of the day, he kind of says, but there's another way of looking at this where everything was fine. And I think people should expect that the information in the report will be scathing, but ultimately justice will not, you will not find justice in this report if what we've heard about is true. I hate to give you bad news, but it's better to be prepared for it, I think, than to, and I particularly hate giving that bad news with Carter in the audience, but people should be aware.
So the big question, I agree with everything you just said. The big question is, will Barr or Durham do more with it?
Yes, that's a great follow-up, and I just want to say further that inspector generals are only allowed really to ask questions of people who currently work in the department. So if you've been fired or moved on, or if you work for a different agency, he has no power there. So knowing that this involved multiple agencies and that most of the people who were engaged in wrongdoing are long gone, there are natural constraints on him that even if he were more tenacious, that would be difficult to overcome. This is why the fact that Durham is running an actual criminal investigation is significant. But even there, you had the Department of Justice run by an AG who recused himself from being able to do anything about any of the wrongdoing for years, and years during which it was very easy for trails to go cold, investigative trails to go cold. It's very hard to determine who a leaker is on a good day. Years after the fact, it's even more difficult. And there was never any legitimate concern about the criminal leaks against Americans who were being targeted by rogue or bad DOJ officials. So yes, I think they're serious. I think that when you hear the Attorney General talk about this, he understands like the common sense approach to it, but there's also a limit to what you can do when you have let years go by with no accountability. Let's have something more positive that we can.
One last question at the back.
First, I want to say, Molly, I read your book and I couldn't put it down. Really, really well done. But my question is precisely when you're talking about all these people at DOJ or FBI getting away with stuff, you sort of casually said, well, of course, the Kavanaugh accusers are all going to get away with it. I remember that woman making up lies to Kate Snow on ABC. Oh, drug parties and orgies and he's got little girls at home. Someone being challenged is crying. Give me a break. So what can be done? And then with future nominees to prevent that.
I do think that.
If she went to prison, that would be a good example.
Right. So that person that you just gave the example of, Julie Swetnick, who was represented by Michael Avenatti. Both Swetnick and Avenatti were referred for criminal prosecution by the Judiciary Committee. They did, they damaged a legal proceeding. They lied. By the way, they were taken very seriously. I just want to remind people, the claim was that Brett Kavanaugh was the leader of an underage gang rape cartel that was roaming the streets of suburban Maryland, and they got major corporate media support for these claims, even though they were patently absurd. They were referred for criminal prosecution, and I called the Justice Department about it in September. Nothing had been done. And the thing that's difficult about that is the process at Department of Justice for handling something like this is that a career bureaucrat really does have the say over whether anything is done, and if a political person applied pressure, that would be portrayed in the media as undue political pressure, and so there's very little that can be done. This is, to me, the big issue at the Department of Justice. Right now we have two completely different standards of justice. If you are a friend of the bureaucracy, you can get away with almost anything. I mean, in the IG report on the Hillary Clinton email probe, it shows that they had multiple people making false statements to them, including Hillary Clinton, and they chose not to prosecute. Whereas you saw with the special counsel probe of the Russia collusion hoax, that any false statement, no matter how much you could interpret it as not intentional or not, was prosecuted. And that is technically within their prosecutorial discretion. You can let things go, or you can prosecute. And the rules and the guidelines allow you to basically do whatever. The problem is this issue that if you're a friend of them, you get away with stuff, and if you're not, you get targeted in really bad ways. I do think the Attorney General understands that this is bad for the Republic, it's bad for the FBI, it's bad for the Department of Justice if people lose confidence in them. Unfortunately, he's kind of alone, but he's an important person, and I do hope, if nothing else, even with this IG report, you'll see modest reforms coming out of it, supposedly. You'll see some facts coming out of it that will be helpful. But I think that there is a large contingent of Americans who care deeply about this issue of justice, and that by continuing to apply pressure, continuing to demand accountability, I think that there is some power in that, and people should keep doing it. Make sure you keep contacting the right people to apply that pressure. Lindsey Graham would be a great person to contact, for instance.
Everybody, join me in thanking Mollie for participation here tonight, but also for this important book, laying down important markers for the future. Thank you.